So, thank you, Tarini. Yeah. And great to be here in the Gent Buddhist Centre. The last time I seem to remember coming here, you were doing up this area. It was really blackened. It was black, like all the walls and things were black, and the shrine room still had a horrible smell in it, and the old restaurant and things. So good to come back in. Yes, it's a bit difficult to know how to angle this. Can I just ask you two, how long have you been involved with Triratna?
Well, I've been a mitra for 3 years.
Oh, right. Oh, good. Yeah, so you know all about Triratna.
All about it.
Okay.
Worldwide.
Yeah.
I've been coming around 2 years.
2 years. Great. So you both know a certain amount about Triratna and been on retreats and things. Yeah. That's fine. Because sometimes, you know, I did something at the London Buddhist Centre and there were people who were pretty much off the street, so then you can say different things.
Sarah also asked for ordination.
That's right.
You didn't
Well, I
say
hope this talk doesn't put you off.
2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Okay, perhaps I'll just start by saying how I came to be writing this book. About 3 years ago, a bit as Tarini said, you know, I've taken a lot of responsibility within Triratna. I first got involved in 1976. I was ordained in 1980. I've done all sorts of things in the movement, and then at some point I became a preceptor and a public preceptor. And about 3 years ago, I really wanted to just have go away somewhere and be a complete nobody. And I ended up living in one of the Pueblo Blanco, the white villages in southern Spain, in Andalusia. Friend of a friend, I had this house. And I landed up there. I didn't know what I was going to do. It wasn't going to be a solitary retreat. It wasn't going to be a holiday. It was going to be something which I didn't know what it was going to be. I didn't know what I was going to do. In that particular village, there were a lot of expats living there, so a lot of English people living there. So I joined a walking group, but otherwise I was mostly on my own in this house with fantastic terraces that looked down to Gibraltar. So it was right down southern Spain, so looking out to Gibraltar, the Straits of Gibraltar, and to the Rif Mountains beyond. So I had these fantastic vistas. I could sit on this bottom terrace and just look out. And I did a bit of reading and I did a lot of walking. And then after about a month, it started to rain, and it rained and it rained and it rained. And I thought, I had this vague idea that maybe I'd like to write a bit about my early life. That's what I thought. But I really didn't want to force myself. I didn't want to have structure. But anyway, it came about. I got this tiny little laptop with me. And I just thought, right, I'll start writing about my early childhood. And I just tapped away and did it when I wanted to, didn't do it when I didn't want to do it. And on and off throughout the 6 months that I was living there, I wrote what ended up as most of this book. But I never thought of it as a book. I thought I was partly doing it for myself. Some of the early stuff, I don't have children of my own, but I have a niece, and I have a great niece who I'm particularly fond of, little Leela, who at that point was 3 years old. And I was thinking, when Leela grows up, maybe she wants to know what her great Auntie Padma did with her knife. So I was imagining writing this for little Leela. When I came to the Buddhist bit, I was thinking, well, Leela may or may not be interested in this. What I thought then was, I'm writing this now perhaps for young Buddhists who are coming along to Triratna today. Because, you know, it was a particular time when I got involved in the movement. So I was just thinking that's maybe who I would be writing for. But when I came back to England, I put it all to one side. One thing led to another, and then I showed little bits to people. I got a lot of encouragement. One thing led to another, and then I spent a lot of little bits throughout the last year working on it, working it over and over and over until I eventually got a book. So that's what it is, and it's called Unfolding, which was a title that came to me. Anyone who's written a book, titles are difficult. But Unfolding seemed to be quite a good title because all my early childhood and things, whatever was happening, everything's always unfolding. And then the subtitle is How I Became a Buddhist and What I Did Next. Because after all, I became a Buddhist at some point, and then, well, life continues, and I continue as a Buddhist in life. So that was the title. So I thought perhaps what I'd do this evening is just say a little bit about how I'm not going to say anything about my early life, pre-Buddhist. If you buy the book or if you're interested in reading the book, you know, I say a lot. I go into a lot of detail about early things in my life. Perhaps I'll just say to you that on the whole, I had a fairly happy, healthy upbringing, you know, parents who loved me, one of 3 children. I went to boarding school when I was 11 years old, an all-girls boarding school. By the time I was 16, I just wanted to get out of school. Didn't want to do any more education. I thought I never want to sit another exam. And my parents were very good because they didn't hold me back, they didn't force me into anything. Between the ages of 16 and 21, I did a lot of travelling. I did a lot of jobs, you know, au pair type jobs. I lived in Italy. I did all sorts of things. All that's documented in there. And the way I've written it, I mean, it's just the way I seem to want to write is, you know, I focus in on a little detail about a life. And it was amazing. I don't know if any of you have written memoir type stuff, but it's amazing how much detail came back to me. I think I'm quite a sensing kind of person, but I could remember sounds, I could remember smells, I could get a sense, a feeling of things. Of course, you know, memory can trick you, so I don't know that it's all absolutely accurate. But I really felt, as I was writing it in the first draft, you could say, that I was reliving my whole life. When I was 21 years old, you know, I'd fallen in love, as one does. I'd fallen out of love, as one does. And I think I experienced dukkha more in other people than I experienced it in myself. But of course there was dukkha there, but it was perhaps more existential. You know, so many people have really difficult backgrounds and traumas and stuff. I didn't have that. But, you know, life is dukkha. The Buddha said it and he was right. And so when I was 21, I thought, I really want to do something that's a bit more meaningful in my life. And that's when I trained to be a nurse. I thought maybe that would be a way of unfolding into something, that could give life more meaning. I trained as a nurse. 1976, which was I don't know whether it was here, but it was a very, very hot summer, was it? Yes, yeah. Anyone who lived through that, you know, say 1976, and they all remember the hot summer of 76. Well, in the February of 1976, I had a gap in my nursing, and I travelled overland to India. It was what was then called the hippie trail. Did you do it?
No.
You didn't, but many of our generation did. And this was travelling from England, you know, obviously right through Europe, and then going through the Middle East, through Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, over the Khyber Pass down into India. And I did that with a group of people in an old van. And I think that really opened my eyes to all sorts of things. And along the way, I met people who meditated. I've no idea really whether I probably did meet Buddhism, but I knew nothing about Buddhism. But I certainly met people who meditated, And when I eventually came back to England, I decided I wanted to learn to meditate. And by this time I'd come and I was living in Cornwall, which is right down in the southwest, very beautiful part of England. And I'd done my general nursing training and I was training to be a midwife. So I was looking for a group, or looking for somebody who could teach me meditation. And in the hospital where I was working, there were 2 posters on the notice board. And one was for TM, Transcendental Meditation. And you had to pay £20, I think it was, and you'd be given a secret mantra. The other poster was Buddhist meditation, free. So, guess which one I chose, and no commitment. And eventually, and I'd go into quite a lot of detail in my writing about, I kept going to this place and the doors kept being shut. But anyway, eventually I found this, it was a meditation class was being held by someone who is Ratna Vandana now, who is Tarini's private preceptor. But she was Janet at that time, and she was leading a meditation class in this upper room in a semi-derelict building, which you had to sign to say that you were going in, at your own risk. Which, when I look back, I thought, well, yeah, that wasn't just the building. So, probably like some of you, it wasn't a Buddhist centre, so it was just a little group, and they met once a week, and we learned the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana. And after about 3 or 4 weeks, Janet said, if you like, you can stay on. We're going to be listening to some taped lectures of this man with a totally impronounceable name called Sangharakshita. They're Buddhist, they're talks about Buddhism. If you'd like to stay, please do. I thought, well, I don't know, not sure at all about Buddhism, but yes, okay, I'll stay. And it was the Noble Eightfold Path lecture series, and it was Bhante talking about, perfect vision. That was the first lecture I heard. And I was completely bowled over by that lecture. It's even hard now to know quite what struck me. But I think Bhante was just, talking about right vision in a way that totally resonated with my understanding of the world, of the human predicament, but went 100 times further than anything I had ever worked out for myself. But there was a real sense of coming home of whoever this man is, and I had no idea who he was, he's speaking truth in a way almost as though I had never heard before. So it resonated really deep. Because I was working as a midwife and I was doing shift work, I couldn't always make the, whatever it was, Tuesday evening class. But Janet used to say, you can borrow the tapes and take them home. And I was living in a nurse's accommodation. So I used to secretly, take these tapes and I'd shut my door and I'd light a candle, light a stick of incense, put on the cassette and listen to these lectures. And I think, when I look back, if I had just stayed with meditation, I don't think I'd have carried on going very much longer. I'd learnt the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana. I thought it was meditation I wanted, and I think it was, but actually it was hearing the Dharma, and the Dharma as taught by Bhante in such clear Dharma. That was what really drew me into Buddhism and what unfolded really for the rest of my life. I often feel very, very grateful for Janet sort of saying, you can stay, but it was such an open invitation. You can stay, you needn't, there was no pressure. I'd been brought up, not obviously, but I have been brought up a Christian. My father was actually an Anglican clergyman, so I had a whole Christian sort of background. So the idea of Buddhism, when you're in India and the exotic Eastern Buddhism, but to actually be the thought of becoming a Buddhist, in the West was a bit inconceivable to me at that point, initially in time. Probably after 2 or 3 months, I went on my first weekend retreat and did my first puja. And I'm sure all of you, even now, can probably remember your first puja. It's funny, isn't it? I mean, I'm just looking and you're all nodding. You all have your own experiences. And, mine was, I don't know what all these words are. Yeah, it's the words of the puja. Well, I don't know what the next sentence is going to be, so I'm not going to join in. And yet, at the end, the 3 bells went and everybody else went downstairs. And I was left in the shrine room, not having recited the words, not having bowed to the shrine, but I felt really, as I was really sort of shaking, something had really touched me very, very deeply, and it was beyond the rational, something of the puja, of the mantra chanting, of watching people probably bow to the shrine, and very sort of surreptitiously I looked around, made sure there was nobody else in the shrine room, and then I went up to the shrine to blow out the candles. And then I thought, I'm going to give this a try. Bow to the shrine, blow out the candles. Yeah. I think I got involved with Buddhism, got involved with the Dharma really very, very quickly. I think I must have been completely ripe for it. When I was doing nursing in London, I'd lived very close to 2 different FWBO Buddhist centres, but I'd never crossed over the threshold, never been interested. I'd travelled to India. I'd never met Buddhism. Well, I'd actually seen the Bamyan Buddhas, and I was in Kathmandu, so in a way I had seen Buddhism. But I had to come all the way back to Cornwall in the southwest of England to contact Buddhism, and I think I was just at a ripe time, a ripe age. I was ripe for the Dharma. And I think that's why I got involved very deeply, very quickly. And I had a lot of life changes at that time. My whole trajectory prior to that had been that I was going to do voluntary service overseas, so working as a nurse, I had those qualifications. I'd even been offered a job in Malawi, in Africa. And suddenly I backtracked from a lot of that. I met Bhante at some point, and I'd heard of the possibility that Bhante there was an order member, Lokamitra, who was going to be working in India with the former untouchable community. And Bhante was very keen to have some social projects running alongside the Dharma activities that were going to be happening. And, Bhante was very encouraging, maybe this is something, I could do, which actually I ended up doing several years later. So I went on, as I'm sure many of you have, I went on different retreats, I met many other people. It probably took me 3, 4, 5 months to realise that this man who I'd been listening to these tape lectures of, he was the founder of, the FWBO, the Triratna. At first I just thought he was some Buddhist guy, they got hold of his lectures and they were playing them. I had no idea until one of these retreats. There used to be a magazine called the FWBO Newsletter, and there were some back copies of that that they brought to this retreat, and I remember flicking through them and just reading about all these, and it was mostly young men and women living together, working together, setting up projects together, leading retreats together, and it all looked actually very, very attractive. There were very few, 1976, so 77, 78 we're talking about now, there were very few books in English on Buddhism, very few. And And Bhante, the main two books at that time of Sangharakshittas were the Survey of Buddhism, which is a pretty thick, dense book, and another one called The Three Jewels, which is smaller, but even that I found very dense to read. But his lectures were something completely different, and listening to the Dharma, I think maybe I'm much more of an oral person, someone who likes the listening, the spoken word, and just hearing the Dharma being taught through Bhante's lectures and all these different lecture series. Often on retreats, on longer retreats, we'd listen to a whole lecture series. So I remember we had the White Lotus Sutra, which probably some of you have studied, I don't know, the White Lotus Sutra. And I remember the first big retreat I went on, night after night, we'd listen to a different tape every night, and the whole, 20 of us or however many there were on retreat would be sitting round listening to Bhante unfolding the myths and parables of the White Lotus Sutra. And again, yes, I found it, I just found myself very drawn in. There's some of me that was holding back. I didn't like the way some people spoke about Bhante. People would rather, I felt, slightly idolise him and talk about, you must meet Bhante, Bhante this, Bhante that, and I thought, no. And yet, when I heard Bhante teaching the Dharma in that way, I was completely sort of drawn in. So I think actually that was quite healthy. There were other cults around in the West at that time. There were the Moonies, don't know whether you ever heard of them. They were a cult, and my parents, you can imagine with my Christian background, they were worried what was I getting drawn into. And I talked quite a bit about that, and difficult conversations I had with my mother, and it's one thing maybe getting involved in Buddhism. It was quite another thing, particularly for my mother, getting involved with a Buddhist organisation. Was it a cult? Was I being brainwashed? And some of those discussions, I was still quite young. I don't think I dealt with very well. My dear father, he was always wanting to try and find the connections between things. So for him, it was trying to find the connection between Christianity and Buddhism. I was always wanting to find the differences, which actually, in a way, is my training with Bhante to some degree. But I wasn't very skilled in that, so I could be a bit, on the defensive with my father, and I don't think that helped. But I was also, trying to find my own way into this, and what did I really think, and was I just going along with what Bhante and people in the FWBO were saying, and how much was I rebelling against my background? All those things, you grow. I felt very much, and I think this came out more as I was writing this, I was still growing up almost biologically, even though I was 26, which, you don't feel as though you're young then, but I think I was still quite young. And I'm also, beginning to grow up spiritually, and it's a bit clunky at times. Clunky? Yeah. Yeah.
Like ice cubes.
Yeah, it could be like ice cubes, but when somebody's the ill-fitting chariot wheel. Yeah, but it's like sort of my communication wasn't very skilled, so things would sort of rub up. And, I was trying to be more individual, and it wasn't always easy.
Like when your limbs grow fast and you're not used to
maybe that's it. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. Yes. Still living down in Cornwall, very quickly we set up a community, a mixed community, men and women together, which at that time in the FWBA wasn't really the dumb thing to do, but we did, and it was great. And it was just lovely living with people who wouldn't interesting because they wouldn't normally have been my natural friends who I might have sort of been drawn to, and yet they held the same values, and we were practicing the Dharma together, and we were exploring things together. shared values, shared enthusiasms. I went on my first women-only retreat, maybe in about 78, and I didn't enjoy it at all. I'd been to an all-girls boarding school. I was really, obviously at boarding schools, you can imagine, there's a lot of cliquiness. Cliquey? Getting into groups, groupiness. And I remember saying to this older member, Manju Badri, he's saying, you should go on a women's retreat. And I was saying, it'll all be cliquey. And he said, no, it won't. Actually, I found the retreat more cliquey than my boarding school. I write about that. So there's some bad moments too. I won't even go into that. But then I made a really good friend with another woman order member, Marlene. Who was she was ordained when she was 19 years old, and she was one of the very, very first women order members. And it was all coincidental how I met her, and she came down to stay in Cornwall. But she was the first woman order member who I really felt that I could sort of look up to. I don't mean look up to really high up there, but I felt I had a resonance with her. And she was struggling with all sorts, interestingly when I look back, because she was struggling with aspects of the FWBO. But she would share all that with me, who wasn't even a Mitra, I think, at that point. So she was very sort of open about things, and yet I could really feel that she had a spiritual maturity which I hadn't got. And she just became a really good friend. It was very, very helpful to me. I met Bante at some point. And that was actually quite ordinary. He was living at Padmaloka at that point, and I met him one-to-one, and we had sort of quite an ordinary conversation. I don't think I held him on anything much of a pedestal. Later on I did, but at that point I didn't. Then something else I think I'd like to get across is how in those 70s, early 80s, everybody in the movement was, practically everybody was young. We were all young. Some of you know, and some of you don't know. You may have heard of Subhuti, who's written lots of books and did lots of seminars and things. So he was he's probably only 2 or 3 years older than me, if that. But I thought, gosh, here's this really, extraordinary order member who's so articulate and things like that. If I was 26 or 27 when I met him, he would have been 29 or 30. But he seemed, much older. We were all in our 20s and 30s. The whole movement was like that. And then there was Bante, who was so much older. He was probably in his 50s, something like that by that time. And of course, a lot of us had come out of the hippie generation. I mean, quite a lot of early order members had been hippies. I had pretensions to be a hippie, but I never really made the grade. I think I always had jobs and things, which I think was not part of hippiedom. Yeah. And of course, the whole, I think I was attracted to the hippie thing, and it was the whole sort of dropping out of society in the usual ways. But the thing is, with hippiedom, you drop out of society, but you don't drop into anything terribly creative. Whereas with Buddhism, maybe you drop out of mainstream society a bit, or that's the language one would have used then. But Buddhism then offered so much of potential and growth and something far, far greater than just dropping out. Because you've got to drop into something else and not just drugs and whatever else was going along at that time. So I moved. I lived in a women's community for a bit, despite that horrible experience of my first women's retreat. I moved down to the London Buddhist Centre, which some of you will know, and to work there. And I gave up nursing. I did little bits of nursing sometimes. But I started working with other Buddhists. We set up a restaurant, the Cherry Orchard restaurant next to the London Buddhist Centre. I became the first manager of that. And it was all so exciting. It really felt as though what we were trying to create together, I mean, we were terribly idealistic. And when I look back, I think, goodness me, I wonder what we looked like from the outside. But from the inside, it was very, very exciting. It felt we could do anything. We all lived, practically everybody lived in communities. Most people gave up jobs and things and worked with other Buddhists. We had all sorts of cooperatives, team-based right livelihood. Around the London Buddhist Centre, it was almost like a Buddhist village. And I was totally happy with that. But when I look back, I think, if older people had come along or people who'd already got family commitments, I suspect we were very off-putting to them. At the same time, it's a real difficult thing to, you look back now and you think, well, yes, we were naive. At the same time, it took an awful lot of energy to get the movement to grow, to expand, to, take off in the way that it has taken off. So yes, we made some mistakes. I think we put people off. But something was happening. And Bhante was somewhere in the midst of it all. And I certainly had quite a lot of personal contact with Bhante, leading up to my ordination, which happened 4 years from my first contact. I was ordained in 1980. And I did have a lot of one-to-one contact with him. I went on seminar with him. And in a way, anyone at that time who was serious about Buddhism met Bhante. You just would. And he obviously was ordaining everybody who took that step. And he was our founder, he was our teacher. Yeah, so, I think a lot, I'd sort of sum up a lot of the late 70s and the 80s was a time of a lot of experimentation. We experimented with working together, we experimented with living together. We were finding collaborative ways to live a full-on Dharma life. And we were doing it in a very gung-ho way. Gung-ho? Yep, come on, we'll do it. And we're trying to find ways of living the Dharma in the Western world, which was all new, novel. Bhante was pioneering a lot of that experimentation. And after all, he always set up the movement. This was not going to be a movement of more traditional nuns and monks, which would never have attracted me. I mean, it might have done initially, but not many people lead that kind of full-on lifestyle. So then, how do you lead a full-on Dharma lifestyle in the West? So there was a lot of trial, a lot of experimentation, a lot of error, I'd say. We were all very inspired by Bhante's vision of the new society, which, I won't say anything about that now, but this was, it was living, working, being, a new society, a world based on Buddhist values. And we and Bhante wanted to spread that vision far and wide. So, it all started really in England, around this one Englishman. And the spreading of the Dharma was a constant thrust. Bhante was always encouraging people to go off to new countries, go off to new continents, found new Dharma centres. And I remember when I was in maybe 1981, something like that, when I was living in London, around the LBC, London Buddhist Centre, and a small group of people went off to America to pioneer setting up the FWBO in America. Others went off to Australia. Others went off to India. That was part of the whole vision, going off, seeding little projects. And then here in, it wasn't here in Belgium, but in Holland, so in the Low Countries, you had Vajragita, who was Dutch, and she was, pioneering in her own way, and she was living here at that time. I think she was in Utrecht and Arnhem, but she would get order members to come over from England to start activities there. So, everywhere there was this idea of spreading the Dharma. I'll move on a bit, because I want to say a few things to sum up. In the 1982, I went to live and work in India, and actually for most of the 1980s I lived and worked in India with the movement in India. And there's a bit of one chapter here about that. So I was using I went there really because I thought I was going to be using my nursing skills to do social projects in slum areas, which I did, but I ended up doing loads of Dharma teaching for Indian women, and that actually became my main focus of my work in India. And in 1987, so I should say up till the 1985-6, Bhante had ordained everybody, men, women. We didn't even have the word preceptor, it was just Bhante ordained people. And then it was clear, oh right, one day Bhante's going to get too old for this and one day he'll pass on that responsibility. So I think it was 1985 or 6, Subhuti, Kamalashila and Subhadra did the first ordinations of some men in India. So that was the first time Bhante wasn't ordaining people. And a couple of years later, he asked myself and Srimala and Ratnashuri, two other English Dhammacharyas, to do the first ordinations of women in India. So I'd only been ordained 7 years at that point, but I became a private preceptor. And at the time, I don't think I realised what a big step it was. Well, it was obviously a big step for me, but it was the beginning of, men ordaining men, women ordaining women, which was very obvious that would actually happen when I look back. Didn't think at the time that would happen within Triratna, the FWBO, because, and it's very, that men would do men and women would do women. So that's very much part of the FWBO approach. But it was very radical, if we think about it, in the Buddhist world at large, to have women ordaining women, because they don't, it's usually men ordaining women. So there's so much, we can criticise Bhante for things and all sorts of things, but Bhante always was so clear on principle about things. And, as the years went by, the ordinations all got handed over, and now there's many, many preceptors. So I want to sort of finish talking a little bit with some sort of looking back from where I stand now. In those early days, everybody knew everybody. We were small. When I was ordained in 1980, within the UK, I'd met every single order member, man and woman. There was only one person who was Subhadra who I hadn't met at that moment in time, and he came up and introduced himself on my first order weekend. There's hundreds of order members who I have never met now, but everybody knew everybody. So, there's a loss and a gain to that. It's wonderful, the expansion, and we need that and we want that. And there's something of the loss of the intimacy too. In some ways you're quite lucky, I think, when you have a small centre, at least you have the intimacy amongst each other and you all know each other quite well. But, it's huge now. So, yes, so I think a loss is that... let's talk about some gains first. Today, I think that Triratna is a much more effective vehicle for communicating the Dharma. When I came along, there was Bhante teaching, and then one or two senior, they were called then senior, they're probably only 3 or 4 years in the order, senior order members teaching. But now we have order members who've been practicing for 20, 30, 40 years. they've got their own experience of Dharma practice, so one's not just relying on Bhante and the sort of very first people, and there's the whole sort of generational thing coming down from that. So, there's much more experience throughout Triratna across the world. And today there's so many retreats, courses, classes, everything that we have that you can tap into, go to, if you want to. Whereas then, there might be one big summer retreat a year, which everybody in Europe would come to, and one maybe winter retreat. Today there's also a much, benefit, I think, is there's a much bigger generational span. As I say, we were all in our 20s and early 30s, still a bit immature. Now you have people who are, in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and you still have 20-year-olds, hopefully, coming along. So you have all that, which is, I think, much healthier, and, a lot to be gained from that. I think some of the losses, perhaps, are... We did have quite a, what I might call, anarchic spirit at that time. Everything was experimental. Nothing was really fixed. Bhante encouraged lots of experimentation, and as we know, some of it went rather wrong, but some of it was really good. And I think if you come along, maybe you don't experience, I hope you don't experience that so much in Ghent, because you're still a small Sangha. But if you come along to something like the London Buddhist Centre, it's big and there's all these courses and classes. I think it would be very difficult to come along yourself as a newcomer and feel that you too could experiment in the same kind of way. And I think that's partly just the whole size of it. And something I've got down here, we need more, because we're so big now, we need more organisation. But you can't organise and systematise anarchy. So there's a contradiction in terms. So maybe there's something a little bit lost there. And I think both those two things I've mentioned, the more anarchic spirit and the intimacy of everybody knowing each other, they were always going to be incompatible with spreading the Dharma far and wide. And that's really what we wanted to do. And we wanted to spread the Dharma far and wide because that is the sort of the work of the Bodhisattva. There are people out there who maybe are crying out for the Dharma, even if they don't know that they are. It is very much the Bodhisattva spirit. As I said at the beginning, and as Tarini mentioned, in a way I've always worked within the movement. I've always had connections and other things outside the movement, but the movement has been my focus, the movement, the order, really all my life since 1976. I've taken a lot of responsibility. And I have to say that sometimes the life of calm and the life of activity can definitely be in conflict with one another. And I know any order member, any mitra probably experiences that at times. And although I've sometimes had struggles around Triratna and the way we operate, I have never doubted the Dharma, not since that first listening to those Eightfold Path lectures. I've never ever doubted the Dharma, but aspects of Triratna. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to create community, and I think we've done a pretty good job so far. I do feel really, really fortunate to have found a teacher in Sangharakshita. Yes, to have found a teacher who taught me, and we teach each other. So very clear Dharma, practical Dharma that we can live our lives. But it's also lofty Dharma, and it's got sort of a poetic spirit to it, and the whole mythical realm, and all the aspects that I think Bhante has just brought in. It's just not one line. If it had just been quite heavy, what I call heavy Theravadan Buddhism, I think I'd have flagged a bit. If it had all been Tibetan Buddhism and all sort of wonderful, but I'm not sure how I'd have connected with that. I need to be grounded, earthed as well as lofty. So I do feel very fortunate to have found a teacher, despite all the controversies of recent years. He is my primary teacher, and I feel fortunate for that. I also feel very fortunate to have shared my life, and will continue sharing my life, with so many other practicing Buddhists. I still feel that Triratna, all these years on, 43 years on since my first contact, I feel Triratna is still a very, very worthwhile project for individuals, for our own growth and development, and for the world at large. We are in a new phase now in Triratna. Bante's died just in the autumn. But I really feel the spirit of Triratna lives on. And there's all sorts of discussions. They will go on forever and ever. But, I feel people who are really living the Dharma, living their lives in Dharma, they are benefiting, and I think they're benefiting the world. Many, many years ago, in a particular context, Bante wrote to me, this is when I was living in India, and it was just after Mrs. Gandhi had been assassinated, and I was living, and we were under curfew, and I'll write a bit about that in here. And Bante wrote to me, and he said something about, the world seems to be on fire more now than perhaps it's ever been. He wrote that in a particular context to me. And I think now, 30, 40 years on, and the world is even more on fire as I see it now, perhaps than it has ever been. We do seem to live in great times of stress, everywhere. It's in England, it's here, it's everywhere. People are stressed. And I do feel the Dharma has something to offer. And it's not easy. I think we all need to have, and I'm talking here particularly to order members, mitras, friends. I do think, sort of as Dharma practitioners, we do need to have a strong sense of purpose, a continuity of purpose, and a great love, maha karuna, a great love, a maha maitri, to face the challenges of our very troubled world, because we really are a very troubled world. So, I don't know how that's going to look. I don't know how Triratna's going to look. I feel for myself, sometimes I've worked a lot in Triratna. A lot of my generation, I'm 68 now, and at some point I'll be stepping back more from certain responsibilities, and in a way I'm not going to be one of the ones shaping the future of the order and movement. So, I'm happy to stay in contact with people who are more shaping it more, but I think it is passing it on to other generations, and some of us oldies, in a way, getting out of the way of it to allow that to happen. Yes, and I hope all of us, wherever we are on our spiritual path, will continue to be a radical Sangha, an active Sangha, on our own journeys to transcendental freedom with a very strong Bodhisattva spirit. So, I shall end there.
Thank you.